Krypton is definitely its own worst enemy. While it's not all bad, it does consistently misuse a few of its own elements. First, the movie never really puts its whole genetic engineering plotline to good use. In this movie, every Kryptonian citizen is created in a lab. It's implied that Krypton has a system sort of like Gattaca or Futurama, where everybody is assigned a job at birth based on what they're genetically predisposed to be good at. The first problem raised by all this is, why does the Council ignore Jor-El when he warns them Krypton's gonna blow up? It means that Krypton spends tremendous amounts of time and resources to build and maintain this society based solely on this engineering principle, right? So why aren't they listening to him? Jor-El was literally created to be a super scientist, right? That's his job. This is kind of like if you wanted to start a baseball team with your friends, because you have this one friend who's really good at pitching, but then when it comes time to choose teams, you don't pick him. There is some interesting subtext involved in what Krypton is trying to do, and I can appreciate that. The movie is trying to say Krypton falls because of its own stubborn ignorance and resistance to change. Sort of like the perceived decline of Western or American society today. I commend the movie for attempting to say something relevant, but what strength is genetic engineering adding to that comparison? What strength is it adding to the story or characters? I think the message is actually stronger without it. You could say that the public thinks Jor-El is this eccentric scientist or like an out-of-touch intellectual. You could still compare it to how Western culture has kind of come to mistrust its own scientists, with things like climate change denial, anti-vaxxers, anti-evolutionists, etc. It would also be kind of like how nobody listens to Stephen Hawking when he says things like robots are going to rise up and kill us all someday. We know he's a brilliant scientist, but this seems ridiculous. Even though, if he's right, we'd be totally screwed. I think that comparison is a lot clearer, because, well, we don't have genetic engineering in society today, and it's not like this is any kind of a looming issue. You might say that the purpose of the engineering in this movie is to try and make a point about choice. That the Kryptonians can't change because they're pretty much these autonomous robots who don't even really have free will. But I think all this really does is make us completely unsympathetic to Krypton's destruction. Like how when they die, we're just kind of like... Besides, Clark wasn't genetically engineered. That was part of the point Jor-El is trying to make, right? Jor-El's speech about choice, hope, and destiny is like the most hopeful part of the whole movie. And isn't he saying that just because you're born a certain way, you shouldn't be robbed of the choice to live your life however you want? So, what if Cal had been engineered to be a counselor, or a plumber or something, but then he chooses to become a superhero? Wouldn't that be a better example of fighting against his Kryptonian destiny? Wouldn't that kind of emphasize that he really has the power of choice? Did you guys even watch Gattaca? Clark often feels like a victim of circumstance in this movie, and this change would have helped alleviate that a little. It would emphasize that he's actually making a choice for himself when he chooses to become Superman. Man of Steel kind of tries to touch on these themes, but it never really goes anywhere, and they just sort of end up muddying the water. Superman's origin traditionally works so well because it's such a simple concept. That's why it hasn't really changed much over the years. So, giving Krypton a bigger role and a more convoluted history really just ends up taking away from that simplicity. And what's being put in its place isn't really adding depth to the story or characters. Then there's these scenes where Jor-El has to fight through all of Zod's men, and then eventually the General himself. But didn't we just establish that everyone is engineered for their jobs? Jor-El is a scientist, and those are trained soldiers bred to be warriors. So why the hell is Jor-El better at fighting than they are? He's even better than Zod, who's probably fought in real wars before. There's this fight scene later on in the movie when Zod says,
I was bred to be a warrior, Cal. Trained my entire life to master my senses. Where did you train? On a farm?
Well, that didn't seem to matter here. Jor-El just beat you up, and he's like a geologist or something. What the hell makes Jor-El so special anyway? I guess it's just his destiny to be a good guy because he's Superman's dad? That's really lazy writing. It's pretty clear what's going on here. 1, Russell Crowe is an action star, so they gave him a fight scene. And 2, this movie has an overemphasis on action and plot instead of story and characters. The worst part about all this is that this fight is completely meaningless to the story. Jor-El could have attained the Codex without fighting anyone, and it wouldn't have mattered at all. The whole thing should have been left out completely. Speaking of this thing, so the movie implies that this codex thing is like an ancient Kryptonian ancestor, and it also tells us that it's a storage device for genetic information. It's the only way they can reproduce, so it must be pretty precious. A concept so precious to their society that there's only one of them. Seriously? This is the only copy? Never mind people stealing it, what if it breaks? Come on, put that shit in a RAID configuration or something. And not only is it the only copy, it's also completely unprotected. I mean, Jor-El just walks in and takes it. There's not even like a locked door. Definitely not a security team of these laser whip robots like this one we see later on. Hey Zod, you know how your whole plan kinda hinges on this one thing? Maybe you should have grabbed it before attacking the council. Better yet, why not do that instead of attacking the council? All that'll do is turn people against you because you're this heartless murderer. So, couple questions. Why is this the only copy, and why isn't it widely available to everyone? It's not like Kryptonian citizens are gonna sneak into the lab at night and engineer an illegal baby. I mean, if a couple really wanted to make a baby, there are easier ways. Which is kinda exactly what happens. So, to be clear, yeah, I understand that Krypton has to die, and that all of these poor choices they make are part of the reason. I get that. What I'm saying is, it's stupid. It's messy, and it's badly written. Don't have these kinds of sci-fi elements if you aren't going to take the time to develop them properly. And none of this belongs in a Superman movie. We're not done yet. A large part of the symbolism behind Superman is that he's the last son of Krypton. That through him, some part of Krypton lives on. Everyone gets that, right? It's a really simple, clear, and powerful idea. So why make it more complicated than it needs to be? Man of Steel tries to make this point both literally and figuratively. Clark's both the last son of Krypton and a literal genetic petri dish containing samples of all of Krypton's population. Don't they know that literalism is kind of the antithesis of symbolism? Hey Goyer, there's a difference between a complex story and a convoluted plot. This is a sillier point, but does everyone on Krypton have one of these flash drive things? Or did Jor-El just invent it? I feel like this is something every single person would do every night before bed. Then if something bad happened, like you died in your sleep or had a car accident the next day, there would be an up-to-date, perfect copy of you. It'd be like nobody ever died. Hey, wouldn't it be kind of a cool idea for the bottled city of Kandor from the comics? It would be this virtual Krypton full of digital people that Clark could never really touch. I wonder if they'll ever use that. Then you have this scene where the... Damn it, Goyer, not everything has to be about sex. Anyway, Krypton finally blows up once the bad guys are safe. Because if they didn't have a one-day justice system, the bad guys would have died too. So can you see what I mean when I say this whole thing seems kinda rushed? I can appreciate a lot of what they tried to do here with Krypton, I really can, but it all kinda misses the point. Explosions don't develop character, fight scenes don't progress story, and all of this is in a sequence that really doesn't need to be here in the first place. Superman's origin is powerful because it's really simple, and if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So, how did Earth 1 handle Krypton's destruction? Well, it almost doesn't. It avoids these issues altogether by showing that Krypton was destroyed by an outside invading force, instead of from within. It also didn't have any of this weird genetic stuff going on. Actually, until Volume 3, we don't even know much about Krypton. Because if Clark doesn't know the details, and we aren't learning them from his perspective, they really don't matter to us or the story.